Welcome back to part 2 of lecture number 1 on Reconstruction. We left off with a discussion of the Black Codes, a series of laws that were deliberately designed to curtail the rights of freedmen and women. I'll give you some examples of what I mean. Many states began to impose work contracts on former slaves. South Carolina, for instance, forbade blacks from leaving the plantations on which they worked without permission of their owner. Typically, former freedmen would sign maybe a yearly contract after the war saying, I agree to work with you through this harvest year of 1866. If you broke the terms of that contract, then in many states, Mississippi, for example, you could be arrested if you left the plantation, arrested, brought back, and whipped for violating the terms of your labor contract. Or in the case of the South Carolina law, which I mentioned just a moment ago, you had to get the permission of the plantation owner just to physically leave the plantation to go visit family members, to go to the store. In other words, for many white landowners, they are desperate to lock in a labor force. And they are creating these laws for their economic benefit, certainly not for the benefit of their laborers. They want to lock down their physical mobility too, because they want to keep them on the plantation. They don't want them going to cities to find good paying jobs. So you have cities like Mobile, Alabama, which passed a law which said that unemployed blacks who could not, quote, give a good account of themselves, unquote, could be sentenced to forced labor for that city for 6 months. So you could very easily imagine a freedman who had just come to the city of Mobile from the surrounding countryside. He's looking for work. A Mobile policeman comes up to him and says, hey, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm here looking for work. Oh, you're not already working right now? You're unemployed? Well, yeah, I've just gotten into the city, last week. Oh, well, now you're working for the city of Mobile for free for the next 6 months. Many of these black codes also tried to exert social control over newly freed black men and women, limiting the behavior and activity of these individuals. For instance, the state of Florida made disrespect towards whites a crime. What does that mean? What does disrespect mean? The law could basically be interpreted very broadly to enforce that freedmen and women must defer, must always agree with and give in to what whites say. Florida's law enforced a penalty of 39 lashes as well for any former slave who might come into a whites-only setting. This is laying the groundwork for systemic social segregation in the South. Many southern states also began making it a crime for blacks to own weapons of any sort. There was a deep-seated fear among former slave owners that their former slaves were going to rise up in retaliation and revenge and slaughter them. That never happened anywhere. But for those that are authoring these black codes, this fear leads them to restrict the ability of former slaves to even own any weapons. These black codes were also about political control, trying to deny the right to vote to black men. So tell me, what does all of this sound like? During Reconstruction, blacks cannot vote in the South. They aren't allowed to have weapons. They must be obedient to white authority. They cannot mingle with whites socially, and their labor was strictly watched by whites. Sounds a lot like slavery, doesn't it? In all but name only. And you can bet that if it sounds that way to our modern ears, that it certainly sounded that way to the radical Republicans in Congress, who will begin to fight back against these state-level black codes by issuing a constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment. Remember that federal law always supersedes state laws. So this is a federal response. This is the radical Republicans in Congress in one fell swoop, by passing the 14th Amendment, automatically invalidating all of those state-level laws aimed at depriving blacks of their civil liberties. The 14th Amendment now states plainly that an individual state could not deprive a person, regardless of their skin color or previous condition of servitude, of their rights without due process of law. White Southerners were enraged. They looked to President Johnson. They said, you're one of us. You're a white Southerner. How can you stand by and allow Congress to defend the rights of former slaves? What we're going to see, though, is that we're entering into an era known as radical Reconstruction, where it will be the radical Republicans in Congress who will start to steer the course of the nation during this period of Reconstruction between the years of about 1867 and 1877. How, though, is Congress able to do this? How are they able to take this lead role in steering the nation through this turbulent period? Well, part of it you can put down to the fact that many of these states, southern states that had seceded from the Union, are not yet back in the Union. So for Texas, for example, they are not readmitted back into the Union until 1870. Georgia is the same. What you see is that while these states are in limbo, they're in legal limbo, they're not yet back into the United States, they have no representation in Congress. So angry white politicians are not there in Washington, D.C. to block radical Reconstruction. Another way Congress will manage to take the lead role in steering during this period of radical Reconstruction is by sidelining President Andrew Johnson. When he fires his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, the sole remaining radical Republican on his cabinet that he inherited from President Lincoln, he will be impeached for violating the Tenure in Office Act. While he will not be removed from office, the process of a presidential impeachment is hugely embarrassing for anyone to have to undergo. And so Johnson will basically learn through this process of being impeached in 1868 that he has no real power in the nation's capital. And so now that radical Republicans are taking control, this era known as radical Reconstruction will be marked by much closer federal control of what's taking place on the ground. Here's what you need to know. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 will contain an important piece of legislation within them. They will contain the provision that all the southern states, except for Tennessee, which had already been readmitted, that all the southern states be divided into 5 military districts. Then the U.S. Army would be stationed on the ground in these 5 southern military districts to help oversee elections in the regions for delegates to the state conventions. Why is the federal government sending in U.S. troops in peacetime into the South? Because they know about the shenanigans taking place on the ground. They know that black voters are being disenfranchised. And for Southerners, they will howl again and protest. How dare you? Freedom from a peacetime standing army is in the Constitution. We should not be subject to federal oversight. Meanwhile, radical Republicans in Congress told angry white Southerners, if you would play by the rules, if you would stop all this terrorism of freedmen and women, then we wouldn't need the South, or we wouldn't need, the U.S. Army to come in and watch over what you're doing. It's during this period of radical Reconstruction that we'll see yet another constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment, which will take effect in 1869. This amendment prohibited individual states from stopping voters from casting their ballot on Election Day based upon their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It will not, however, grant women the right to vote, so women will still be prohibited of all colors, will still not be able to vote yet in the United States. But this particular amendment was aimed at enabling freed men, former slaves, male slaves, making sure that they can now cast their votes. 1868 is another presidential election year, and we will see that for many Northern Republicans, they are done with Johnson. President Johnson is also done with being president. After the embarrassment of his impeachment trial, he steps aside, and we will see President Ulysses S. Grant take over the White House. He will serve 2 terms in office as the nation's commander-in-chief, and he had that certain name recognition because he was largely responsible for spearheading the Union victory against the Confederacy in the Civil War. Unfortunately, while Grant was a magnificent tactician on the battlefield, the skill set that he earned as a general in the U.S. Army did not necessarily translate well into the office of the presidency. I say all this because he was a soldier by nature. He was a man with little political acumen. And as president, he will rely very heavily upon his advisors, his cabinet members, to make some of the day-to-day decisions for him. Unfortunately, some of the trust that he placed in his advisors turned out to be misplaced, as we'll see a series of scandals rock Grant's 2 terms in the presidency. In particular, we will see with the Credit Mobilier scandal and the financial panic of 1873, we're going to have the nation's economy kind of thrown into the dumpster for several years. We will have some 10,000 companies fail across the country by 1878, leading many Northern Republicans to say, you know what, maybe we need to get back to the business of America, which is business. You're going to start to see a waning of enthusiasm among Northern Republicans for Reconstruction, for this Reconstruction process to continue. As the nation's economic health began to deteriorate, many Northern whites began to grow tired of the constant battle on the ground against Southern whites terrorizing former slaves. In other words, by the time we get to midterm elections in 1872, we're losing Republican dominance in both houses of Congress. You're starting to see more Democratic challengers winning office. And we're beginning to see among many Northern whites them saying, you know what, apparently we're just never going to fix this endemic racism in the South. So instead of continuing to pour resources into protecting the rights of freed men and women, maybe we just need to call this process over and just move on with healing the country's finances from this point forward. And then let's think about white Southerners who had never been members of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. White Southerners continue to flock to the Democratic Party. In large measure, the Democratic Party in the South becomes the party associated with white supremacy, and they're very open about that fact during this period. They are staunchly segregationist. They will fight any Republican measures for civil rights. And you put these two trends together, you see a strong support for the Democratic Party in the South among white Southerners. You see increasingly Northern Republicans leaving that party as the nation undergoes a fiscal depression. Many of them beginning to vote for the Democratic Party, and you start to see the electoral map change significantly by the 1880s. But more specifically, in the South, you will see a reliable phenomena from election to election, where white Southerners will only elect Democratic politicians to local, state, and national office. This reliable pattern of the so-called solid South, white Southerners voting for Democratic nominees over and over again, you see this persist really until the middle of the 20th century. After Grant's 2 terms in office, we have another presidential election looming in 1876. And by that point, you've got not only support for the Democratic nominee in the South, but support for the Democratic nominee in the North as well, Samuel J. Tilden of New York State. And we will see that the election of 1876 for president will be hotly contested. Look, you can see the electoral vote evenly split, right? 50% for the Republican nominee Hayes, 50% of the Electoral College for the Democratic nominee Tilden. The nation was thrown into turmoil for weeks and then months. After voters went to the polls that year, they still didn't know who their president was going to be. There were Democratic threats that they would march on the nation's capital if Hayes, the Republican, was elected to office. We'll end up seeing a compromise worked out behind closed doors to resolve the contested election of 1876. This will become known as the Compromise of 1877. Essentially, we will see that the Democrats will finally decide to step down with the understanding that if they let the Republican nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes, take office, he would help them out in several important ways. Hayes agreed to do a number of things, such as appoint Democrats to his administration. More importantly, though, Hayes will also agree to start sending federal funding to the South to help rebuild its infrastructure that was still lying in ruins almost 2 decades after the end of the conflict. Hayes would also agree to the Democratic suggestion that all federal troops be taken out of the South once and for all. White Southerners had hated their presence ever since the Reconstruction Acts had been passed. Hayes, in order to become president, said, "I can do all of that." Reconstruction comes to an end with the Compromise of 1877, and with the withdrawal of U.S. troops, the terrorism of Southern blacks will begin anew at the hands of the KKK.